I was routinely molested sexually from the time I was 8 until I was 10 by a handful of men in my city who were pretty adept at gaining the trust of young boys and seducing them and then engaging them sexually in exchange for money, gifts, affection. And there's no question that that played into my confusion later on in my life. And then my own decisions I'd have to factor in there. I mean, I decided for years to experiment sexually with anyone who would allow me, girls in junior high school and high school, adult men when I was in high school. I began using pornography while I was still in elementary school. So I think the factors that contributed to it would include my own emotional brokenness long before I was introduced to sex, the sexual violations, and then my own responses to those violations. I did not know God at all, no. Although it's interesting you ask that, I did believe there must be something out there. In fact, I took real comfort at night in praying to whatever was out there. It was hard for me to believe there was not a God. But by the time I was in junior high school, I knew that if there was a God, he couldn't possibly approve of the fact that I was already sexually promiscuous, that I spent a good deal of my time living in the netherworld of pornography and sexual fantasy, or that I was already using dope. And for those reasons, while I believed there must be a God, I also was afraid of facing God. I think if you ask anyone who has been either sexually molested or physically abused, they'll tell you that there are lies you begin to believe when that happens. You tend to believe that that is love, that what people want from you is either physical or sexual, that what matters the most in life is power, how to get it, how to keep it, that you don't have much to offer apart from that. And so when I would pray after having been molested, I thought that God probably was watching. I just didn't think he cared. And I was hoping if I could get his attention, maybe he would notice me and do something to either put me in a more loving environment or give me the strength to say no to this, or somehow race me through my childhood so I could skip the years until I was old enough to be on my own. In other words, I thought that God knew, I just didn't think it mattered to him. It didn't even occur to me to get angry at God until much later in life. I didn't believe as a child that I had the right to be angry at anyone. Most of the people in my life either bullied me or abused me or humiliated me. And when that's what you get from most of the people in your life, you learn what I call a conviction of non-entitlement. You believe that you're not entitled to be hurt. You're not entitled to be angry. And so I assumed that God was just one more of the many people who didn't much care what happened to Joe Dallas, and I assumed that that meant Joe Dallas wasn't of much value. If you really don't think you're of much value, you don't think you have a case against anybody. So it never occurred to me to be angry, only afraid. I remember the first time it happened, the man met me in the lobby of a theater in the downtown area, and he struck up a conversation with me and won my trust and seemed to be a very nice, normal-looking man, by the way. And when he asked me if I needed to use the restroom and followed me, and I did not think anything wrong was about to happen, I noticed he was very nervous watching the other people in the restroom and waiting for them to leave, and when they finally did, he shoved me into a restroom stall and began to take me sexually. And when he did, I remembered thinking a variety of things. He likes me. I'm not sure what he wants, but whatever it is, I don't want him not to like me, because I finally got a grown man who likes me. He is telling me this is the right thing to do, so it must be. This feels weird to me, but I must be wrong, which, by the way, taught me not to trust my own instincts. All of my own instincts were saying, it's all right to touch me on the shoulder, but everything else you're doing is wrong. My whole body screamed out against that. But I pushed that down because I assumed this grown man knew better than I did, and after all, he liked me. And if he liked me, I didn't have any right to say no to him. So I learned simultaneously not to trust my instincts, that this is what it meant to be liked. And in my distorted thinking, I assumed that this was what I had to offer. So those, in essence, were the thoughts going through my mind. My father was a very hardworking man, and my father seemed to feel from the time I was a boy that I was not what he wanted. Now, I never quite understood why or what I could have done, but from day one, I felt, whether correctly or incorrectly, that I was unacceptable to him. So I was very hungry for a man, a father figure, to bless me, affirm me, identify with me, welcome me into his manhood and his masculinity. And not getting that where I wanted it, I was willing to take it wherever I could get it. Well, that's where I got it, or at least what I thought was it. I think that I sensed more keenly a clear rejection from my father. I think I sensed from my mother exhaustion. I think she loved me. In fact, in retrospect, I'm convinced both my parents loved me very much. But at the time, there were things I needed from both of them that they didn't seem able or willing to supply. After the first encounter I had with this man who I met in the downtown area, he did introduce me to other men. There were other kids in my neighborhood who frequented the hotel that these guys owned, and they would show us pornography. Now, at that time, Playboy, I believe a couple of other men's magazines, and some very amateurish, grainy, black and white films were just about the only game in town when it came to pornography. But they would show that to us to, help arouse us and create a generally erotic environment for their practices. But that got me fascinated with pornography. And I began, by the time I was in 5th grade, learning to swipe Playboy magazines and a couple of the other magazines that were common at that time from liquor stores, where they would be kept on the lower cabinet, and stuff them under my t-shirt and bicycle away. And then by the time I learned how to masturbate in about early 7th grade, I was routinely using pornography as a masturbation aid. So for that reason, unfortunately, I picked up the porn habit very early in life and learned to rely on it, I think, much the way an addict or an alcoholic relies on a chemical to help them function. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend hours per week just fantasizing and losing myself in a world I would create just by looking at the pornographic images. And of course, that gave me a very distorted idea of what is supposed to happen between men and women, and what people are there for, and what love is about. I would say, especially when I hit the junior high school age, I pretty much cut off any emotional connection with Dad. Now, the great irony of that, by that time, I think my dad was reaching out to me. I think he was concerned about me. He could see that I was withdrawn. He could see my grades going down. He could see that I sort of lived in my own world. And I know it bothered him. And I think he tried, in his own faltering way, to say, "Son, I care about you. I don't know where you are, and I'd like to know where you are." But I had already decided by then, this guy is hurtful, this guy is ignorant, this guy is a source of too much pain, he's not going to understand, I don't want to deal with him. So in essence, I gave my dad a death sentence. I basically said, "Off with your head." And from then until my adulthood, I emotionally was completely disconnected from him. I was born again when I was 16. I heard the gospel. I was dating a girl who I was pretty crazy about, and she was chaste, which fascinated me because this was the early 70s. It was the height of the sexual revolution. Everybody was doing it. But she was different, and the difference was very clear. She took me to a church with her. I heard the gospel, went under conviction. For about 3 months, I wrestled with God until finally I said yes and was born again, very quietly on my own. I got into fellowship, started reading the Word, started growing to an extent, and those first few years were wonderful. Then I got into full-time ministry. Now, immediately after being born again, I walked away from pornography, homosexuality, heterosexual fornication, all of it. Just cut it all off, no problem there. Still lusted and fantasized, occasionally masturbated, but by and large, all the acting out, the overt stuff, I walked away from immediately. But I did think that having been born again, I should reach a point where I could never be tempted again. Now, nobody ever overtly told me that, but I thought it was true nonetheless. And you know, at that time, oddly enough, even though America was in the midst of a blatant casting off of sexual restraint, in the church, sex was still largely unaddressed. When I went to church, I heard testimonies about everything, but I never heard testimonies about anyone delivered from fornication, pornography, or homosexuality. So I assumed I was the only one who had ever struggled with those things, and I sure wasn't going to be the only freak in the congregation, so I kept that to myself. And it built and it built. I would not deal with it when I would lust or fantasize until finally, after 7 years as a Christian, when I was 23 years old, I walked into an adult bookstore, curious about hardcore pornography. And that set into motion a level of lasciviousness that I had never engaged in before. I began using hookers. I had an affair with a married woman and terminated in a pregnancy that terminated in an abortion. Met the owner of a gay bar, got into a relationship with him for about a year. And after that, heard about a church where you could be both gay and Christian. And I thought, now that's the answer, because I had been so raunchy for the past year or so that I thought, gee, I can't live this way, but I wasn't quite ready to give up my own kind of sex either. And so when I heard you could have it both ways, I thought, that's it, perfect. And so I joined the gay church, the Metropolitan Community Church. And I was with them for about 4 to 5 years, even served on staff with them for a time. But all the time there was a nagging voice saying, you're kidding yourself. And I would shove that down and do what I wanted to do until finally in January of 1984, God, I think very quietly, was convicting me and drawing me back because I was so hungry and restless. I mean, there was no big catastrophe going on in my life, but I was very dissatisfied, and I wasn't sure what for, because my life was going reasonably well, decent job, circle of friends, social life, what have you, but I was very hungry for the fellowship with God that I had had, until I finally realized, even if God has not cast me off, even if this isn't going to send me to hell, I don't have the intimacy with him I used to have, and I want that back. And that's when I repented. I believe the primary deception of the gay church is a one of entitlement. If something feels natural to you, you're entitled to it. Your satisfaction, your gratification is what counts the most. In fact, I'd have to say this respectfully but clearly, so far the testimonies I have heard from people who call themselves gay Christians are based largely on a celebration of self-acceptance rather than discipleship. And I think that's the primary deception, is that the most important thing in life is for you to accept yourself just as you are, and then feel comfortable just as you are, and then slap a Christian label on that and say you are a follower of Jesus Christ because you think he's wonderful, you love him, and in some ways you obey him, but the acceptance of your sexuality was the real turning point in your life. To my thinking, that's anything but a biblical concept. A large part of the biblical concept of following Christ is dying, after all. I had to look at the fact that I had made a god of Joe Dallas. My great sin when I backslid into homosexuality was not homosexuality or fornication or adultery or pornography. Those were symptomatic of a greater sin. I had said, in essence, I matter more than God. My satisfaction, my feelings, my gratification means more to me than breaking the heart of God by my behavior. It was idolatry. And out of that idolatry, all sorts of uncleanness sprang out, both sexual uncleanness and moral uncleanness of many types. It certainly is true that no one has the corner of the market of God's love and his attention. If God was interested in interrupting my life, he is interested in interrupting anybody's life, and very concerned. So I think the next step to take is to ask him to give you the ability to believe, to grasp his concern and his love for you, to ask him to give you a vision of your life that he has, to ask him to give you his dissatisfaction with your life and his care that your life become what he means it to be. I think that's a great place to start.